In 1943, the average American family was feeding themselves off less than 400 square feet of backyard soil and doing it without a single bag of fertilizer. Not because they were experts, but because someone taught them a secret the chemical industry would spend the next 80 years trying to make you forget. 20 million victory gardens bloomed across this country during World War II. Rooftops, vacant lots, narrow strips of earth beside apartment buildings. And the people tending them weren't agricultural scientists. They were secretaries, factory workers, grandmothers, and kids. They were producing 40% of the nation's vegetables. 40%. With kitchen scraps, ash, leaves, and a handful of methods so effective that when the war ended, an entire industry mobilized to make sure you'd never hear about them again. But here's what they don't tell you. Those methods still work. Every single one of them. The soil doesn't know what year it is. Biology hasn't changed. And the 6 composting secrets I'm about to show you don't require a single purchase, a single product, or a single trip to a garden center. They require only what WWII families had. Scraps, time, and the knowledge that's been quietly buried for decades, until now. Right now, somewhere in a garden center near you, there's a wall of products designed to solve a problem that was already solved, completely for free, before your grandparents were born. Bags of compost accelerator, tumblers that cost $150, microbial activators in little plastic bottles, worm castings sold by the pound. And the people who manufacture those products are counting on one thing, that you never find out how unnecessary they are. The average serious home gardener in America spends between $200 and $400 every single year on soil amendments, compost boosters, and fertilizers. Every year. And the results? Mediocre at best, dependent on continued purchases at worst. Because that's the design. That's not a coincidence. That's a business model. You buy the product, your plants grow, the product runs out, and you're back in the store. The moment you learn to build living soil from scratch, using what you already have, that cycle ends. And they know it. I know what you're thinking right now. You've tried composting before. Maybe it sat there for 6 months and smelled wrong. Maybe it turned into a soggy mess. Maybe nothing happened at all, and you figured composting just wasn't for you. But here's the truth. You weren't doing it wrong. You were doing it the way the internet taught you, which is a watered-down, ineffective version of methods that were specifically simplified to keep you confused and dependent. What WWII families knew, and what we've largely forgotten, is that there are specific techniques, not just throw scraps in a pile, that transform waste into soil amendment so fast and so effectively that it feels almost unfair. When the U.S. government launched the Victory Garden program in 1941, they weren't just asking people to grow food. They were quietly unleashing decades of suppressed agricultural knowledge directly into the hands of ordinary families. The extension pamphlets they distributed, the radio broadcasts, the community garden workshops, these carried real, old-world techniques that had been practiced by farming communities for generations. Techniques from European peasant farming, from early American settler agriculture, from methods so ancient they predated the chemical fertilizer industry by centuries. And families used them, desperately, creatively, and brilliantly, because they had no choice. Wartime rationing meant no excess money. Limited transportation meant no easy access to supplies. And the simple, burning need to feed children meant no room for methods that didn't actually work. What survived that pressure was pure effectiveness, nothing fancy, nothing expensive. Just 6 core composting approaches that, used together or separately, could transform nearly any soil in a single season. Think about that for a moment. Families with no agricultural training, working in tiny urban plots, were producing harvests that surprised even the government officials who had encouraged them to try. That didn't happen because of luck. It happened because the methods they were taught were genuinely extraordinary. Here's the part nobody talks about. The moment the war ended, something else ended with it. And it wasn't just rationing. The chemical fertilizer industry, which had been largely redirected toward wartime munitions production, came back online in 1945, looking for a new market. And they found one. Or rather, they created one. Over the next decade, a massive coordinated marketing effort convinced American farmers and home gardeners that the old methods were primitive, inefficient, unscientific, that modern chemistry had something better to offer. And it worked. Within a generation, the Victory Garden pamphlets were in landfills. The techniques passed down through farming communities faded as those communities urbanized. The specific, practical knowledge that had fed millions of families during the hardest years of the 20th century was quietly replaced by a dependency on purchased inputs, and corporations profited enormously. When you understand how much money is generated annually by home gardeners buying soil products they don't need, the motivation to suppress simpler alternatives becomes very clear. This isn't paranoia. This is just following the money, exactly where it leads. Let's get into the secrets themselves, starting with the first one. And this one is so simple, it'll make you angry because once you hear it, you'll realize exactly how much money you've wasted buying the product that was designed to replace it. The first method is called trench composting, and WWII families used it constantly. Here's how it works. You dig a trench in your garden bed, about the depth of a shovel head, roughly a foot deep and a foot wide. You fill it with kitchen scraps, vegetable peels, coffee grounds, eggshells, fruit waste, anything that would normally go in the trash. Then you cover it with the soil you dug out and you plant directly alongside it, or on top of it if it's a few weeks old. That's it. No bin, no turning, no waiting for a pile to finish. The decomposition happens underground, right where the roots are, feeding plants directly as the material breaks down. WWII families called this in-ground feeding, and they did it continuously throughout the growing season. Always a new trench, always in a different part of the garden, rotating as they went. The soil in those plots became darker, richer, and more biologically active with every passing month. Modern compost bins sit above ground and ask you to wait. This method skips the wait entirely and puts the nutrition exactly where it's needed. WWII families didn't have the luxury of waiting 3 months for compost to break down, so they figured out how to force nature to move faster, using nothing but materials they were already throwing away. The second secret is what they called a heat stack, and it's the closest thing to a compost accelerator that exists, except it costs nothing. The principle is simple. Decomposition generates heat. The faster material breaks down, the more heat it generates, which speeds up the breakdown further. It's a self-reinforcing cycle. WWII gardeners learned to build their piles in a specific way to maximize that heat. They layered green materials, fresh grass clippings, vegetable scraps, young weeds, with brown materials like dried leaves, straw, and torn paper in roughly equal amounts. They kept the pile about the size of a large hay bale, roughly 3 feet by 3 feet. They watered it until it felt like a wrung-out sponge, and then they pushed a thick wooden stake into the center of the pile and left it there. When they pulled the stake out after a few days, if steam rose from the hole, the pile was working. If no steam, they added more green material and water. That stake hole also served as an air channel, feeding oxygen to the center where the microbes needed it most. Families working this method regularly produced finished compost in 3 to 4 weeks, not 3 to 4 months. The biology hasn't changed. This still works exactly the same way today. Most people rake their leaves, bag them up, and drag them to the curb. And every single time they do that, they're throwing away what WWII gardeners called brown gold. The third secret is the leaf mold pocket, and it might be the most underestimated technique on this list. Leaf mold is simply leaves that have partially decomposed, broken down by fungal action rather than bacterial action. It doesn't look impressive. It looks like dark, crumbly, slightly damp soil. But what it does to garden beds is remarkable. It dramatically improves moisture retention, which means you water less. It feeds the fungal networks that plants use to absorb nutrients. And it acts as a slow-release soil conditioner T-hat continues working for years after you apply it. WWII families made leaf mold pockets by piling leaves, just leaves, nothing else, in the corners of their garden or alongside fence lines, keeping them damp, and letting fungi do the work over 6 to 12 months. They weren't in a hurry with this one. They maintained ongoing leaf piles every fall, pulling from the bottom of the pile where decomposition was most advanced. A single large pile could supply enough leaf mold to condition an entire garden bed each season. Zero cost, zero inputs, just leaves and time. Every fireplace, every wood stove, every burn pile from 1941 to 1945 was quietly feeding the most productive backyard gardens this country has ever seen. And the ash was only half the story. Secret number 4 is the ash and scrap layer system, and it's a 2-part method that most people have never seen combined this way. Wood ash is rich in potassium and calcium, and it raises soil pH, which matters if your soil is too acidic, as many heavily used garden soils become. WWII families saved every bit of wood ash from their stoves and fireplaces through the winter, storing it dry in buckets or tins. In spring, they layered thin coats of it, maybe a 1/4 inch at a time, between layers of kitchen scraps in their compost areas or directly into garden trenches. But here's the key they understood that most people miss today. Ash should never go on in thick layers. A little feeds the soil. Too much creates an alkaline barrier that actually slows decomposition and locks out nutrients. Thin layers, alternating with carbon-rich brown material, created a mineral-rich, pH-balanced composting environment that produced soil amendment far superior to any single ingredient approach. They were essentially building a biological recipe, not just throwing things together randomly. This one surprised me more than any of the others because it looks almost too simple. But the science behind it is the same reason worm farms are now being sold for $200 a kit. Secret number 5 is what WWII families called living pile composting, and it's the closest thing to a self-managing system I've ever encountered. The concept is this. Instead of building a contained compost system, you create a permanently moist, permanently fed pile in a shaded area of your garden and allow earthworms to colonize it naturally. You keep the pile low and wide rather than tall, about 8 to 10 inches deep, spread across several square feet. You add kitchen scraps to the surface regularly, cover them with a thin layer of damp leaves or straw to retain moisture and suppress flies, and then simply leave it alone. Earthworms from the surrounding soil will find the pile within days. They move through it continuously, processing material into worm castings, which is some of the most nutrient-dense organic matter available anywhere, and aerating the pile in the process. Every few months, you scrape the top active layer of fresh material aside, harvest the dark, crumbly castings from the bottom, and use them directly in your planting holes. Then you put the top layer back and start again. The worms do the work. You just keep feeding them. No purchase necessary, no special setup, just a low pile, kitchen scraps, and the understanding that the biology you need already lives in your soil. The sixth secret is the one that gets the least attention, probably because it requires the least effort, which of course makes it the least profitable for anyone trying to sell you something. This method is called cold fermentation, and WWII families stumbled onto it almost by accident. During periods of heavy food scrap production, canning season, harvest time, families would often accumulate more organic material than their active compost systems could handle. Rather than waste it, they'd pack the excess scraps tightly into crocks, clay pots, or wooden barrels, pressing out as much air as possible and covering the material with a weight. What happened next was lactofermentation. The same biological process behind sauerkraut and pickles. The material didn't rot. It fermented, becoming highly acidic and breaking down rapidly into a concentrated, microbe-rich slurry. When added to garden beds in small amounts, diluted with water, never applied straight. This fermented material acted as both a soil amendment and a microbial inoculant, flooding the soil with beneficial bacteria. Modern versions of this technique are sold commercially under names like fermented plant juice or bokashi at prices between $30 and $80 a kit. WWII families made it in old crocks for nothing. The biology is identical. The cost difference is not. Here's what makes all 6 of these methods work, explained in terms so simple that a 12-year-old in 1944 could understand them, and did. Healthy soil is not dirt. It's a living ecosystem with billions of microorganisms per teaspoon, bacteria, fungi, protozoa, nematodes, all working in a complex interdependent web to break down organic matter and convert it into forms that plants can absorb. When you feed that web with scraps, leaves, ash, worm activity, fermentation, you're not fertilizing your plants. You're feeding the living system that feeds your plants. That's a fundamentally different relationship. And it's why these methods produce results that bagged fertilizers simply cannot replicate. Synthetic fertilizers bypass the biology entirely, pushing nutrients directly into plants the way an IV drip pushes nutrients into a hospital patient. It works short term, but it does nothing to build the living system underneath. In fact, heavy chemical use actively degrades it. WWII families, working without chemicals, were unknowingly building the most productive biological soil systems their gardens would ever see. That's not an accident of history. That's what happens when you work with biology instead of around it. You now know what took me months of digging through old agricultural extension pamphlets, wartime homesteading guides, and victory garden manuals to piece together. 6 methods, $0. All of them working on the same fundamental principle that healthy soil is alive, and your job is simply to feed it. No chemicals. No cost, no complications. The trench that feeds roots directly, the heat stack that finishes in weeks, the leaf mold pocket that conditions soil for years, the ash and scrap system that balances what's missing, the living pile that works while you sleep, the cold fermentation method. T-Het does more in a crock than most people get out of a full composting setup. These methods worked. During the hardest years of the last century, when families needed results, they could eat. They work today for the same reason they worked then, because biology doesn't care about marketing budgets. Here's your one action for today. Go find 3 things. A spot in your garden you can dig a foot-deep trench, whatever kitchen scraps you have right now, and a small pile of dried leaves or torn cardboard. That's your first trench. Do that today, cover it back up, and you've already started rebuilding your soil using a method that fed this country through a world war. Tomorrow, you'll be ready to layer in the heat stack. By next week, you'll have 2 systems running simultaneously, and you'll start to see why families who use these techniques never went back. If you want more forgotten methods like these, the ones that existed before the chemical industry rewrote the gardening playbook, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what's coming next. I'm going back through wartime agricultural records, old homesteading manuals, and pre-industrial farming guides every week, pulling out the techniques that still work and that someone somewhere would very much prefer you never find. Drop a comment below and tell me which of these 6 you're starting with first. I read everyone. They can bury the pamphlets. They can pull the old manuals off shelves. They can fill stores with products designed to replace what you used to know for free. But they cannot dig up the trench you put in your garden today. That knowledge is yours now. Use it.